Ken Bailey had two major pieces that he was presenting in his reinterpretation of the parables. One, I've already mentioned, that the parables need to be interpreted in terms of first century Middle Eastern peasant culture. The other thing that he taught, and which is probably certainly much more controversial among scholars, is that behind the parables that Jesus taught was a Hebraic poetic structure to the parables. And we don't see that when we read the parables, because of course we tend to read them, and all of us are reading them in English, and we're not seeing them as poetry. We're seeing them as stories. But if you look behind the original Greek to the Aramaic that Jesus was speaking, in fact, Jesus is telling us stories in the form of poetry. Ken Bailey would argue that Jesus was a careful student of the prophets and of the Psalms, most of which are written as poetry. And so his early hearers then would have understood exactly what he was doing. But we don't, because we're somewhat removed from what Jesus is saying because of language, or the barrier of language, which makes us twice removed from what Jesus was actually saying. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and he spoke in a poetic form in Aramaic that would have been recognized by the first century hearers, who were the first ones to receive what he had to say. The poetic structure that Jesus was using is known as chiasm. The chiasm is from the Greek letter chi, which is in our English context would be an X. Chiasm is a form of literature that we have in the West. It goes at least as far back as Cicero and other writers of the Greek tradition. It continues in Western writing at least through the 19th century. You occasionally see it in the 20th century, but it's really faded out in our time. You see it readily in writings of a traditional writer like, say, Winston Churchill. For an American audience, the most obvious and probably famous chiasm that we're familiar with was in John Kennedy's inaugural address, in which he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And here we see a classic chiasm. It's two lines, and the logic of the first line is repeated in the second line, but in reverse order. So ask not what your country, major point, country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So if you were to draw a line between country in the first line of that phrase, and you, that is between the first and second line, and then you between the first and second line, you would be drawing an X. And so that's where we get our word chiasm in Greek, or chiasmus in Latin. So in the Western tradition, we're used to chiasms in that sense. Two lines paired together with the second line reproducing the first line, but in reverse order. The Hebraic literature takes that a step further, and that is that an entire poem could be presented as a chiasm. And so you might have, say, 7 lines in a poem, and you would label them A, B, C, D, and then those lines would be reversed. So A, B, C, D, C, B, A. So the Hebrew mind would be used to that kind of chiasmic structure, and they would listen for it. The first line, A, presents an idea, which is repeated at the end of the poem in line A, and so forth. A, B, C are going to be repeated in C, B, A order. And D, the middle line, would be the climax of the poem. Now, we're not used to thinking that way in the West. We're used to thinking in a very linear way, and we're waiting for the climax at the end of the poem. But if you're really going to understand the Hebraic way of expressing a poem, you have to look for the climax in the center. And then you see a kind of twist in the story in the second half, where the ideas are further developed, and amplified in ways that are significant and can only really be understood if you've listened carefully to the first half of the poem. What's interesting about Jesus' parables from this perspective is that they too were chiastically structured. Typically, Jesus would tell a story, a parable, and it might actually be 3 separate poems, each arranged according to a chiastic system that he had developed himself. Some years ago, there was a movie called The Temptation of Christ, starring Willem Dafoe, and in one of the scenes, Dafoe is telling a parable of Jesus, and it's as though he's creating the parable off the top of his head in order to make an argument in a specific context. And Bailey would say that's exactly the opposite way to understand this. That Jesus, in fact, is a very careful literary craftsman who created these poems in advance, or these parables in this poetic structure in advance, memorized them, and then presented them over and over again in the different villages of Palestine. They became, in effect, his set speeches, or Bailey would say using his American jargon, his stump speeches. His disciples would have heard these speeches over and over and over again, maybe hundreds of times. So when they sat down to write out the parables, they would not have had any difficulty remembering them because they would have heard them so many times. So as we approach the parables, then we need to see them as poetry, and we need to see that their climax comes in the middle. And we need to appreciate the fact that Jesus isn't simply telling a story. He's telling a story within the context of a highly cultured literary tradition that he's inherited.